everybody. This is Across the Atlantic. We provide actionable insight at the intersection of geopolitics and capital markets. Today, I'm joined yet again by Mark Chandler, a friend of the show and just a friend in general. Mark Chandler is the Director of Government Relations, Professor of Practice, Department of Intelligence and Security Studies at Coastal Carolina University. Mark has served more than 35 years in DoD senior executive, command, and senior leadership positions focused on national security policy, intelligence analysis, application, policy, and operations. Mark retired from the Marine Corps as an intelligence officer after serving around the globe and in multiple crisis environments. He is also retired from the senior executive service ranks in Department of Defense intelligence and security policy arenas. Mark has held a variety of key positions, including Deputy J2 Joint Chiefs of Staff, Director of Defense Intelligence Agency's Middle East and Africa Center, Director of Warfighter Support of Office of Secretary of Defense, Intelligence, Director of Intelligence Analysis and Partnerships and Engagements for the U.S. Air Force. Mark holds a BA in Political Science from the University of Alabama, Huntsville, and an MS in International Relations from Troy University. He continues to write on issues affecting U.S. intelligence, observations, national policy, concerns, as well as leadership. Additionally, Mark recently founded CASIL at CASIL. It stands for Chandler Associates for Strategy, Intelligence, and Leadership. CASIL is a strategic advisory and education-focused initiative that equips individuals and organizations with the tools to navigate complexity and lead with confidence. Led by Mark, CASIL is dedicated to making complexity comprehensible, empowering clients to move forward with clarity, resilience, and purpose. Mark, thank you so much again. Like you said, we've done this a few times before, so every single time we do this, very much appreciate your time and your insights. So thank you for joining me yet again this morning.
Garrett, it's my honor to be here, and I appreciate you asking and trying to circle back on a lot of what's happening in the world. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've only got you for a limited amount of time, Mark, and I figure we just dive right on in. And this honestly comes at a fantastic time. I say fantastic very loosely. I mean, you could swap a lot of different words out for that. Trying times. There's a lot going on in the Middle East, obviously, and probably top of people's mind is going to be Israel-Iran conflict, and now most recently the U.S. getting involved in some form or fashion. And then yet again, just as of this morning, we were talking a little bit before we pressed record, just the news in the last 2 hours that there's some sort of brokered truce going on, but that might have also been, now falling through the cracks. So I'll just say there's a ton to talk about here. So kicking us off right at the start, Mark, I want to start, small and then work our way up to a grander scale. So about less than 2 weeks ago-ish, on June 13th, Israel launched Operation Rising Lion. So that was the missile strikes, as well as some other strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities by Israel. So this was a coordinated air and clandestine campaign targeting, obviously, nuclear facilities with missile systems, as well as targeting the senior military and scientific personnel of Iran. Now it's super high level, but Mark, I'm sure you've done a lot of research on this, and you obviously know the technical piece of this that a lot of folks here do not know. Can you explain a bit more in depth what this operation actually entailed? What were the goals, and why did Israel do this now?
Well, first off, and I think you're kind of starting in the right place, because that did kind of set everything that's happened, even up in the last 2 hours, into motion a couple of weeks ago. But if I go back in time to try to address the objectives question, if we go back to March, we can look at when President Trump tried to he entered into negotiations with the Iranian regime, saying you have to stop your nuclear weapons development program. And Iran, and I know there's some folks saying, well, no, they don't have a weapons program. No, they do. They are the only country, the only non-nuclear weapon country in the world that has enriched uranium beyond 3.75%.
Right.
You don't need anything if you're doing peaceful purposes. And what they had done is enriched uranium enough for about 10 to 12 nuclear bombs, up to 60%. So they were technically within a couple of weeks of more work on that to have enough highly enriched uranium for those 12 bombs, we'll say. So I think in going through that progress and trying to stop that development, if you will, and have Iran give up the program, Trump said, we're going to work on this for about 60 days. Well, on day 61 is when Israel struck. And I think what Israel did, and they're very close to the problem. You have to understand that Iran is an existential threat to Israel, and
Right.
they definitely don't want nuclear weapons in the hand of the Iranians. So when you look at how this progressed, I think they said now is the time to take action. And I will tell you this, militarily, Iran is at its weakest point than it's ever been since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And you go back to last year when Iran and Israel were taking punches back and forth, missiles going back and forth, airstrikes back and forth. Israel actually did, I would call it the preconditions for this attack when they took out key Russian-made SAMs, the advanced SAMs that they had. That
Surface to
made
air
this,
missiles, right?
yes, those are surface-to-air missiles. Thank you. I'm sorry. So when you look at that, they were able to kind of neuter some of the key defenses that they would have had to face. Israel made a national security decision, decided to go in and do this strike. And I think that's because, in a realistic perception and understanding, they knew Iran wasn't going to budge on the negotiations. I mean, Iran had actually said, no, one, they lied and said we have a peaceful nuclear program, denied any weapons involvement, and two, said they want to be allowed to keep that higher enriched uranium. There's no peaceful purpose for that. So looking at that, Israel struck. Now, that's kind of the objective. Stop Iran, stop their development, and send a message. And so what they did, in a combination of a phenomenal special operations campaign using Mossad operators who had been inserted into Iran over the previous days and weeks, and then their air campaign, they actually went in what we would call it in the military is they conducted a simultaneous decapitation campaign of the senior military leadership. They took out the nuclear scientists that were involved in the development, the research, and all of that throughout the weapons program. And then they took out some of the military capability, the physical equipment. They took some of that out and they hit the nuclear sites. So the first couple of nights, and that first night was a phenomenal raid. You saw Mossad do tremendous operations, surgical strikes to hit the scientists, to hit the military leaders, and to take out that key nuclear equipment before it could be moved. And I want to just preface and foreshadow about that movement part later on. But when you look at that, I think the campaign was highly successful. It was a rapid strike that hit what they needed to do. The surprise was on the side of the Israelis when they conducted that strike. So that's their objectives. That's their physical conducting the mission strike. It was an excellent strike. They lost no aircraft, lost no personnel, and did significant damage that first night of strikes against Iran.
Yeah, and I think the point too, Mark, that you're bringing up of percentage of enrichment and what that actually means and what was actually happening is a point, at least when I hop on, Twitter or any sort of news site, that's always a point of contention and kind of confusion for folks. And honestly, even for myself, I was having a lot of these conversations this weekend with some friends of mine as well. And nobody really knows what that means. Really, nobody really knows what if you just want to have a nuclear civilian program, what level of enrichment that actually means. And I think you bring up a good point. What was it about? What, 2% or something low like that, right?
It's about 3.65%.
Three.
So that's,
Yeah.
if you have a nuclear power plant, that's all you need. You don't need
Right.
anything higher than that. Anything higher, you're headed toward a weapons program, weapons
Yeah,
development.
right. There's no reason to have it above 3% if it's just civilian nuclear energy. And I think the last thing that I saw was they had it about Iran had it about 60%, right? And
Yes, they had
so,
the
yeah.
the hardest part, and I apologize for interrupting,
No, no, no.
Garrett,
Yeah.
but the hardest part of taking that enrichment is to go from that peaceful 3.65% to 20 and then 60%. That takes a concentrated effort, and
Right.
you have to focus on doing that. Iran has done that for years.
Right.
And so their only purpose is weapons development to get to that 60%. The next level to go to what we call highly enriched, which is about 90+%. That's what you put in the core of a nuclear warhead. To
Right.
go from that only takes weeks. This middle part I'm talking about takes a few months. We're only 2 weeks, if that, to get to that next level. That's how rapid they could take that program.
Yeah, so it just seems, it's suspicious isn't the right word, but if you're saying one thing and doing another, no matter who you are, it belies your true intention, right? Uh,
Absolutely.
yeah, and I think that's the key part that a lot of people are missing. There's that connective tissue of like, okay, what are intentions versus what are they saying? And I think a lot of people, a lot of Americans now, young, old, in the middle, whatever, they usually hear that first line only of like, oh well, they just wanted civilian nuclear program, but in fact, and in their own by their own actions, they were moving very much away from just the civilian aspect of that nuclear program.
They were,
Uh,
and Garrett, let me just add, because that you're right. This is still a debate and a lot of lack of. I'm not a
well, there's
nuclear
a lot of
physicist.
information out there, right?
Yeah, there is,
Yeah,
but this isn't just U.S. intelligence reporting it or Israeli intelligence, because some people will say, well, that's just them kind of cooking the books. No, this
sure.
is factual data from the UN's Atomic Energy Inspection, the IAEA.
Yeah.
And so they go in and they inspect to know how much is in there. And those are their numbers. Those are their reports. So you can't argue with the nuclear physics side of this process.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. Um, so moving on to the next piece, Mark. So Rising Line comes in the wake, and you had mentioned this too. We had that 60-day period of negotiations that President Trump sent, right, or had set. And so we were chatting with them for about, in 60 days, what is that, like about 2 months, two
Yep.
months-ish. We had crossed that threshold, and on the 61st day, Israel launched these attacks, or I guess they started their operation, I should say. So, um, I'm trying to, and again, this was part of the conversations I was having this weekend with some folks. So I'm trying to square some circles on my end, right? So we had President Trump had ran on a very popular sentiment of getting the U.S. out of entrenched conflicts. Obviously, you and I imagine probably more me than you, but we aren't privy to a lot of private information and conversations that are happening at the highest levels. So, setting that context of we don't really, we're not inside the room where these decisions are being made. I mean, what do you believe changed that allowed this shift, or was this maybe there was never a shift and this was always the plan? As you said, like, we just made true on our word and that we set a 60-day negotiating period. Nothing came of that. And so on the 61st day, you saw what happened afterwards. Maybe that's the case. Maybe, again, there's some information that decision makers in our government had access to that changed the math for them. I'm not sure, but in your own thinking, Mark, I mean, what do you think about the whole situation, and how it came to be the genesis of the whole situation?
Well, I truly think, you look at his actions, you look at his mannerisms, his words, and I think at the core belief, President Trump does not want warfare, does not want fighting. He truly wants the fighting to stop, whether it's between Israel, Hamas, Israel, Iran, Russia, Ukraine. He wants that to stop. He's not uh, one to kind of push that fight and let's get involved in that regard. And so I think he was very sincere in the talks when he set those back out 60 days ago, so before the Israeli operation. He was
Right.
very sincere in that and trying to bring them along. I think sometimes we can want something so bad that we kind of don't see uh, the way, especially in authoritarian regimes such as Iran, such as Russia, might be trying to manipulate and trying to just drag us along. And I think I know Iran was dragging the negotiations out. They could have agreed back on day two to stop the highly enriched uranium process. They could have agreed to open for inspections. They could have agreed, but they kept dragging this along just like they have done, for a decade or more. And so I think the president truly said, let's get a deal. And I think you can see that boiling over a little bit in the last couple hours today. His frustration at the ceasefire he tried to implement last night, in what Iran did, what Israel might do in the coming minutes or hours, while you and I are talking. So I think there's a lot of frustration there, but I think one, he reached a point, had discussions with Netanyahu before Israel started their operation. I'm not so sure that the president gave permission, if that's the right word for Israel to do it. But I think he was at a frustration level of maybe this will force them into a negotiation and come into a settlement out there. Uh, and so
Right.
Israel had its reasons for conducting the operation. Again, I'm not so sure they requested permission from the president, but I
Right.
do believe there was coordination in a way to allow our forces to be prepared for any kind of Iranian counterstrike. So yeah, peace, non-war is his mantra, I believe.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's also a good point too. Of you set the deadline and they're kind of dragging their feet, and like you said, it's not that hard to. I mean, maybe and tell me if I'm wrong, but it's not that hard to go backwards from 60% enrichment down to a more civilian level, 3%.
Well,
Yep.
it is a process to do that,
Okay.
to take it
Yes,
out,
of course.
but
Yeah, yeah.
but the but the easiest thing to do, just allow us in or allow neutral inspectors in, gather all that data, take it away, and we can then take it out of their country.
Right.
Yeah.
And you mentioned a good piece too. So the follow-on, right? So after the initial start and launch of Operation Rising Lion, we obviously saw Israeli strikes on nuclear facilities in Iran, and then, of course, after that, very shortly after that, we saw Iranian missile strikes back towards Israel, right? This was going on, and this all started June 13th. This was going on for a few days. And there was obviously a big will there, won't they, from the US of are we going to get involved in any sort of meaningful way? And as of a few days ago, I believe it was Saturday night, I remember getting a ping about that. The US finally decided to get involved with our own strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. Now, there's a lot of cool technical aspects about that. Our use of the B2s and the engineering behind those are incredible and really fun to talk about. But beyond the fun parts of that, Mark, how effective do you believe our U.S. strikes were in achieving the intended goals of dealing serious damage to Iranian nuclear facilities? I've heard again, just from everything I read, and this just speaks to the myriad and plenty of information that is out there, but they all kind of say some contradictory things. And I find it really hard to get to the truth of the matter. It's like, were we effective in our strikes using these bunker busters, or were we not? I've heard yes, I've heard no, I've heard also in the middle. What do you think there?
You know what, Garrett? I think I'm going to try to give you an answer that covers yes, no, and in the middle. That way,
Okay, yeah,
now I'm going to run for office because I'm
that's
dancing
right.
around.
Yeah,
Now, first, if I can preface the attack and the objectives real quick, I want to go
yeah,
back to that negotiation piece because
right,
Israel had put military pressure, significant military pressure. They had killed follow-on leaders who had replaced the initial ones they killed. They killed more scientists. They hit a couple of those nuclear sites. Iran said, "Okay, let's talk." And so there were meetings in Geneva last week.
okay,
And again, I think this is the president reaching out while there's a fight going on between Israel and Iran, saying, "Come on, guys, let's reach a deal."
right,
And then Friday morning, at least Friday morning our time, I started seeing reports that Iran came back and said, "Yeah, we're not going to negotiate while we're under attack, and we're never going to give up enrichment." I think that might be the straw that broke the camel's back. And
gotcha,
and and then so we lead into that the Friday, Saturday, the president gives the orders to conduct a strike, and then we send the B2s and all that cool bombing stuff that is fun to talk about. We went in and attacked.
right,
And we also used cruise missiles off a submarine, 400 miles away to launch. And so that attack, what we focused on primarily was Fort Out. That's the one everybody hears about. It's what we used the 30,000-pound bunker buster bombs on. I think we used 12 or 14 on that. And then
wow,
we also hit Isfahan and Natanz. Those are the three key nuclear facilities that they had. The objective, destroy that enriched uranium, destroy their ability to make any more of that. And again, I don't want to get into nuclear physics, but there are things called centrifuges that allow you to separate the gas, the uranium. It all works out. Those are very finely tuned and very sensitive pieces of equipment. So if you were to try to balance something, you don't want any vibrations. They can't withstand even a minor violation.
Oh
So
well.
what we did, and that in Fort Owl, that's several hundred, about 260 to 300 feet underground in a mountain. That's why we use those weapons. Matter of fact, before I retired, we were part of developing that and testing some of those for this specific purpose. They'd never
Oh
been
well.
used in anger before. So, part of that to go specifically against this Iranian problem set and North Korea. Just want to send a message to them in case they want to keep things going. But I digress. But the point is, your question, were we successful? Yes, militarily as an operation, this was success. When you look at the limited unclassified photos that have come out, you can see precisely where the bombs hit. It takes 2 bombs per hole to go in there and achieve the explosive objective that you're trying to reach. Now, remember, I said, that equipment stored under there, the centrifuges are sensitive. The IAEA even came out and said it is highly unlikely any of that could have survived intact and operational from such a concussive blast from those bombs. Remember, you had about 12 of them.
Right.
So anything that was inside Fort Owl I would go out there and I'm giving you a better than 50% chance, maybe up to 90, that it's ruined. It can't work. It's destroyed at this time. What we don't know, and the intelligence community and operational community are doing what we call battle damage assessment, BDA. We need to see inside. And until we can see the insides, we won't know how much, is the facility ruined? Did it cave in inside? There's a lot of good, engineering, weaponizing or weaponeering and engineering that goes into developing these bombs and where to place them that probably caused some collapses inside. So that's what we're looking for inside. Then at Isfahan and at Natanz, there's Isfahan has some underground storage, so we probably need to be a little bit more effective there. And Natanz had more above ground storage. All of those, when you look at the destruction that I've seen in the images, you can see significant destruction all across both of those sites. So militarily successful, bombs on target, hit the facility and then work their way through. This, if it didn't destroy their nuclear weapons capability program underground, it's so severely degraded it that you're set it back for years.
Wow.
Now,
Yeah.
one caveat I would have is after Israel started their campaign, and you were going on for about 10 days before we struck, how much, if any, uranium of that 60% enriched uranium did Iran remove from Fort Owl? That's kind of a question. There were some images that came out that showed convoys set up. So let's say we destroyed significantly damaged Fort Owl. How much, if any, did they get out and where did that go? That would need to be something we need to follow up with. So I'm going to give it a military success. And those B-2 pilots, the fighter pilots, everybody involved in this operation, kudos to them. Great military operation on their part, and they achieved the objectives that they were told to. There is damage to the Iran nuclear weapons development program. That I can say with confidence. The degree set back a few years. Did it stop it? Let's find that other uranium. Let's see where we are.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's the biggest piece that nobody really wants to answer because the implications of the answer in either direction could mean more U.S. involvement, or it could mean, hey, like, what we're talking about here, we got the job done and we accomplished what we came to accomplish. Of did we severely cripple the nuclear program enough to not be involved? And if not, what does that mean? Do we have to continue to be involved in a kinetic way? So bringing us along, Mark, in the conflict, right? So we launched these strikes that we talked about, and I appreciate the analysis there. Very shortly after, and again, I know we're dating a lot. We'll have the date up of the recording of this podcast because things move on a daily and hourly basis,
Yeah.
seemingly in this conflict. But since the U.S. launched our own attacks on those nuclear sites, Iran subsequently launched missiles at U.S. bases in both Qatar and Iraq. Now, I've seen this classic, but I've seen news reports that this was telegraphed to the U.S. ahead of time. I've also seen reports it wasn't. However, Qatar also shot down a lot of the missiles, I understand. And no U.S. service members were injured or killed. So I take that as a success. I would also take it as a bigger success if Iran did let us know ahead of time. I mean, that's just 100% choreographed at that point, because they are just, I mean, they seem to be losing the kinetic conflict part of or aspect of this conflict. So given that, where do we go from here, Mark? Where do you see it going from here if you had to look into your crystal ball? Um, and obviously, as of this morning, we talked about this slightly at the top of the hour. There was an attempt at a ceasefire that fell through, I think, as of an hour ago ish. So I don't know where this goes. Obviously, I know you don't know for sure where this goes. Obviously, but Mark, if you had to look into your crystal ball, what do you think happens from here?
Garrett, that's a great lead in, and that's a great question with the nuances that you brought out about a choreographed Iranian response. They are losing the kinetic fight significantly, and so when you look at that, I go back to the beginning of our conversation when I talked about Iran being the most vulnerable, militarily vulnerable it's ever been since the revolution in 1979. And so
Right.
you look at that, I think the Iranian mindset. And when I talk about the Iranian mindset, I'm not talking about the people. I'm talking about the ruling mullahs, the
Yep.
Ayatollah, and the IRGC, Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. That's kind of the core aspect of what rules Iran, if you will. And their mindset is one, we're going to have a nuclear weapons program. That's national pride, and that gives us the ability to spread our influence throughout the region. Two, we're gonna push back on anything we can and not show any weakness. That's that choreographed strike, if you will. They had to strike even under the threat, but I think that's also why they telegraphed that strike, because one, they couldn't afford what the United States would bring down on them in destroying a lot more military capability.
Right.
Israel's destroyed a significant amount. So where this goes, with the breakdown of the ceasefire, first let me give you this depressing thought:
Sure.
ceasefire does not equal peace,
Right.
and ultimately we would like peace in the region. I don't think we're going to get there. So ceasefire means let's stop fighting, and I think Iran right now is struggling internally with how to fight back, not show weakness, but at the same time not lose the remaining part of its capability that allows them to have some sort of ability to pressure the region, which I think is almost gone. But more importantly, how to control the Iranian people. So I talked about the Ayatollah. He's the supreme leader,
Right.
and they rule that ruling mullah council. The Ayatollahs rule that, but the IRGC, since the revolution, has gained so much power, so much authority that one, I would almost equate it to how Pakistan, the military and the intelligence service in Pakistan, is really the power behind what's going on. I think the IRGC is not going to allow the Ayatollah, or the Ayatollah can't really show any weakness, because the IRGC is going to continue to push this forward, if nothing else, to stay in power. I mean, you are talking, an autocratic regime that rules, and any kind of a regime like that doesn't want to lose power. So maybe I lost a little bit in trying to explain what's taking place there, but I think you are seeing messaging that, hey, we've got to stop getting beat up,
Right.
conflicting with messaging of we're not going to show weakness out
Right.
there. You know,
Right. So it's not going to be that unconditional, very public surrender that I know President Trump was tweeting about, excuse me, a few days ago. Um, right. And like you said, I mean, the choreographed nature of it would indicate it's like, hey, we have to do something to justify our own existence, but we don't want to hurt anybody. We don't want to further escalate because we really can't punch back.
right,
But we also can't take the public image hit on the chin, as it
right.
were. So that makes a lot of sense. So I guess that would indicate that they're ready to talk. And again, maybe these talks are going to happen. Likely, these talks, I would imagine, are going to happen away from public view. So, Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg or whatever article everybody's reading out there, they're probably not going to be published until obviously after everything's said and done. Um, yep.
If I may, Garrett,
Yeah, please.
I I would hope that this is going to drive them to the negotiating table. But that when we look at something like that, and what I talk to my students about and my analyst about all the time is let's not mirror image what we would do if driven to that kind of position or
Right.
under military pressure. And I go back to as recently as last Friday, before the president made his final decision to attack, Iran was still belligerent in talks with people trying to help them get Israel to stop. They still said, we're not going to negotiate under pressure, and we're not giving up our nuclear weapons program
Right.
that they don't have. So, so when you look at that, you kind of got to go, okay, will they come to the table? I wrote an article for the Castle newsletter. It was a special edition, and I said, here's what a good deal looks like. Talking about the president's negotiations with Iran and their nuclear weapons program, it's destroying all of that uranium, destroying their ability to enrich anymore. And so that was those centrifuges I was talking about in Fort Al and at Isfahan that make that enriched uranium, uh, turning over any remaining elements of what you can help weaponize the program with, and allowing inspectors, boots on the ground, to go in there and look specifically at all of these sites and check them out. You've got to get the eyes on, the smart people and their eyes on. That's the negotiation that Iran needs to come to the table and accept. So, no, they're not going to, as you said, they're not going to accept an unconditional surrender.
Right.
But will they accept what I just laid out, those four conditions, to make everybody comfortable that Iran has given up its nuclear weapons program? But there's a strong sense of national pride from
Right.
the Ayatollahs and the IRGC. That's what you're facing as you go forward in the next days and weeks.
Okay. Yeah, no, and that brings up a really good point, Mark. So, and it also kind of dovetails with some of these other scenarios I want to talk about as well. Um, and I think, you know, we would not be doing the conversation justice if we didn't ask tough questions. And so I love that, hey, look, this is what a good deal looks like. These are the conditions that would satisfy, obviously, of course, the United States, then hopefully Israel as well. Um, but I mean, I'm curious. I mean, would we, or I guess probably more Israel, as you mentioned, this is more existential for them. Um, would we be okay with the current regime in power, with a neutered nuclear program that, again, you said we're able to inspect and ensure it's not going above X% enrichment, or is it so far gone at a point that we're now talking about regime change, as well as a destruction of the nuclear program, right? Now, again, these are like, some dark questions, some big questions, because of course, whenever you talk about regime change, nothing is certain. You don't know who's going to fill a power vacuum, and then the follow-on effects of that. But again, I think it's worth asking and talking about. So, I mean, at a grander scale, at a grander geopolitical scale, so, we talked a lot about the conflict itself. So bringing us back up here, um, what does it look like if the current regime stays in place with a hindered nuclear program? And this is what you were talking about for what a good deal looks like, I think. Are they still a threat? I imagine no, if we're able to come in and inspect things. And then my second question, we can take this piece by piece. I know I'm asking you a lot here. What do you believe or think the region would look like under a different Iranian regime? Who might that be? Again, it's hard to say. A lot is variable there. But who might that be? Maybe contenders that Americans aren't familiar with. So we can start with the first piece, Mark. What does the geopolitical environment in the Middle East look like if the current regime stays in place, but with a hindered nuclear program?
So I think, and you're right, that's a lot to chew on, Gareth.
Yeah,
So,
right.
so let me look at first, not Iran not having a nuclear weapons program. I think
Okay.
that's first and foremost what everybody wants to stop.
Right.
Uh, it has, and just let me, for the record and for history, the JCPOA that came out under the Obama administration never really stopped the Iranian nuclear weapons. So no one has been able to achieve that. So if we could get to that level, I think you would have a degree of comfort for Israel as that existential threat. For the United States, because of what a nuclearized Iran looks like as proposed as a threat, and something that people talk about, on the periphery is all the Arab states, while publicly might be saying it's bad what the U.S. did, it's bad what Israel did. Privately, they are clapping their hands and
Right.
cheering because of the Iranian threat to all of them.
Hmm.
So I think there would be a big sigh of relief of that. So that would be good to have a good deal, whether we get it kinetically or at the negotiating table.
Right.
Second, what about the regime? Now I need to just give you, and I'll try not to bore you with a lot of history, but
Please.
this regime started in 1979 with the revolution. And at that simultaneous start, what did they do? They took American hostages.
Right.
So they did that. And then this regime, developed a proxy network across the entire Middle East, starting with Hezbollah. You've got the Shia militias. You've got the Houthis that came into the circle later on. You've got Hamas. So you've got this proxy network that has been knocked down, but knocked out, but knocked severely down.
Right.
So 1979, they take hostages. 1983, they bomb embassies in Beirut with their Hezbollah, the fledgling Hezbollah. They take out the U.S. embassy. Then they take out the Marine barracks. I was a young Marine at this time, and they
Right.
take out the Marine barracks and kill 241 U.S. servicemen. And so that's what they've done. When I go move forward, they had a war in the 80s with Iraq, the Iran-Iraq War
Right.
lasted, from the early to the late 80s. When I moved back to the Middle East for my second war stint, and I was in Desert Shield, Desert Storm, but then in '03 when we invaded Iraq, and moved our way forward, yes, we were fighting the Iraqis. Then we fought militia there, uh, and who else did we fight? We fought the Iranians because
Right.
the Iranians brought in through the IRGC and the Quds Force they brought in this thing called an explosively formed penetrator, EFP. And that was one of the most deadly weapons that the U.S. military faced. And it was an Iranian weapon. So that alone is responsible for hundreds of deaths. And then their support,
Right.
if you move forward for the Syrian regime, Assad and propping him up when the people of Syria rose up, Iran was right in there first to help push that back. And
Right.
then their support for Hezbollah has continued. So that's all non nuclear stuff. And that is the destabilizing effect that since its inception, the ruling Iranian theocratic regime, and it's followed through two ayatollahs, that's what they have set up to try to control and spread their form of Shia Islam across and create that destabilizing effect, which they have done very well since 79. So, long winded answer to talk about that regime still will continue to try to do that. And it's going
Right.
to continue to reestablish what Israel has knocked down during the Israel Hamas war by neutering Hezbollah,
Right.
neutering Houthis, what the U.S. has done against the Houthis. So I think as they work toward that, trying to resurgence, if you will, you could see a more destabilized area under the current regime, as epitomized by Ayatollah, and I mean the supreme leader, and then the IRGC.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so the background on that is phenomenal, Mark, right? So I mean, right now you hear the word nuclear and TV segments and articles, etc. But I think it's really, really, really important to contextualize with all the non-nuclear stuff that was happening since, I mean, for the past few decades,
Yeah.
and even longer, right? Via this new Iranian regime led by the Ayatollahs and the mullahs.
Yeah.
So I mean, look, I mean, this is a state that is obviously a state sponsor of terror in the region,
Yep.
if not the globe, and they've killed plenty, like you said, hundreds of American servicemen and women in the region. So it's really important to contextualize that with like, look, they are no friend of obviously Israel, but certainly not the U.S. as well.
No.
Right. So it's really, really important, I think, to set that context. Really important to set that context for folks and what it actually means when we're talking about not maybe regime change as a goal, but what that may mean in just a broader sense and broader scale. Now, you also talk about some important things here too, Mark. So what does it look like? So, everybody packs up their bags and goes home. But let's say the current Iranian regime stays in place. What are the lessons learned from them? Now, if I'm them, and this goes to your point of what you're saying. It's just like, they could be a more destabilizing force in the region because, they've learned it's like, well, if anything, we need to make ourselves more of a porcupine, not less. And again, if I'm them, I mean, I'm taking the lesson of, if we had nuclear weapons, maybe this wouldn't have happened. Maybe Operation Rising Lion would not have happened. And I think North Korea is a good real life case study of that. I mean, the whole reason that they've even survived that regime and North Korea has survived to this long into 2025 is because they have weaponized
Yep.
nukes. And so we're
Absolutely.
not able to launch these sort of operations in North Korea as what's happening right now in Iran. And so I think, I mean, I don't know. I mean, the other piece of this is, yeah, great, we can destroy these nuclear sites and facilities and even the researchers and scientists. But I mean, inevitably, you can't get everybody. You can't destroy the knowledge of how to make these things, right?
No.
And so that to me is the dangerous part. I mean, I think 10 steps, 20 steps into what the post conflict arena might look like. And it just seems inevitable that you would at least try to and attempt to rebuild what you had. Again, the knowledge you can destroy a lot of the infrastructure, but the knowledge you can't destroy that's out there
Right.
that's in the world, right? Um, so it seems to me, like you said, you would have to have inspections, some sort of verification process. But then outside of that, it's I think into the future, barring regime change, and I'm not advocating for this, but I'm just purely trying to think about it from a pragmatic stance. Barring regime change, excuse me, I think it looks to be a very dangerous scene in the Middle East for
Yeah.
years to come. Post. I'm not sure if you have any thoughts there.
No, Garrett, you bring up some excellent points. And first, let me touch on that North Korea thing. You're absolutely
Yeah.
right. North Korea has unclassified about 50 nuclear bombs, nuclear
Right.
weapons. They haven't. We don't believe they've gotten the ability to put it on a missile warhead, so that would make them even more dangerous. But
Right.
they talk a lot of rhetoric. They have
Right.
a lot of rhetoric, but we're not attacking them yet. And so you got to look at that. There's a relationship I would caution everyone about between North Korea and Iran. And
Right.
so I think the big lesson learned that Iran takes from it, and that you were addressing that, is if we had had a nuclear weapon, Israel probably wouldn't have attacked, and the United States wouldn't have attacked because we could, nuke somebody. So I
Right.
think that's something that as they recalibrate and reassess, they're going to have to look at uh, as this regime stays in there. And regime change, I'm not advocating it. If I were still there and you asked me, okay, what happens? Who takes over if this regime fails? If it falls apart, I'm going to
Right.
tell you I don't know, but chaos will ensue. If you look at Syria, which crumbled back in December of 24, rapidly fell. That was after a 10-year civil war.
Right.
You had opposition forces, fighting forces, whether they were aligned with one another or not, fighting each other, all really rebelling against the regime in one way, shape, or form. And because of what Israel did inside Syria, kind of neutered Iran, neutered the Shia militia there, neutered the Syrian military, what they did created a vacuum that the rebels were able to rapidly move in and take Damascus. Assad fled to Russia. You've now got kind of a neutering of the Iranian military, but what you don't have in Iran is a rebel movement. You don't
Right.
have an armed forces that have thrown up because back in the, I want to say it was 22, but don't quote me on the dates. I apologize. But I know it's been a couple of times in the teens. There were massive student protests against the regime. The IRGC went in and just clamped down on that, killed thousands of students, locked up thousands more. So with that kind of oppression that's on there, there really
Yeah.
isn't an uprising that you see forming in Iran. So that's why I'm saying chaos will ensue, but this regime's going to clamp down hard on any movements.
Yeah, 100%. I think that interplay between North Korea and Iran, it brings up a really good point. And as we start moving up and talking about a grander scale here, Mark, I'm interested to, look at that relationship a little bit more. And in fact, Iran's relationship with, of course, Russia, but China as well. And you and I have talked about this. Gosh, what is the third or fourth time
Yeah.
we've done this before? But we've talked about all of these countries before and what they're commonly referred to as, this axis of upheaval, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of course, being China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, these four countries. I think seeing how they've all worked and interplayed together, or just individual reactions, even in light of Operation Rising Lion in the Middle East, has been super telling and super interesting. So, most people were looking for, some sort of any response by Russia or China. And that's obviously right now just been largely muted and left to just rhetoric, words of support, essentially. But of course, they're not coming in any sort of kinetic way. One, I think
Right.
limited, at least on the Russian side, limited capability to do so. They're still, as we've all forgotten because we're so consumed with the day to day, but Russia is still having a war of aggression against Ukraine. That's still going on as we speak today.
Mm-hmm.
So they're incredibly limited on what's actual material support they can provide. And then China, of course, is balancing the oil that they import from Iran, which is a lot, with our trade talks and economic relationship with China. So obviously they don't want to bring the ire of the U.S. onto themselves by saying anything more than good words about Iran. So I think their reactions have been super telling and super interesting. Um, and so, I think it's also been telling, a few months ago and last year, even when we were having these conversations, Mark, I mean, it seems to be at the onset or the continuation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine that this axis of upheaval was working much more closely together, right? China and Russia's declaration of a unlimited, partnership and friendship. Iranian sending of their Shahed or Shahid drones to Russia to fight the war. North Korea sending both soldiers and ammunition to Russia. So they seem to be working in greater concert together, all four of them. That was about a year ago, or at least in
Mm-hmm.
2024. Now, as we sit here in June of 2025, in a lot of ways, this axis of upheaval doesn't seem to have the fangs that it I say once did, or it doesn't seem to be working in tandem or in concert together like they were about, a year ago, let's call it. What factors do you, Mark, in your experience, what factors do you believe are driving this? Um, and it has were they previously aligned than previously thought? Would love to hear your thoughts there.
Well, number one, I mean, that axis, I think, is an alignment. It's an alignment of convenience, and they're all focused on one common adversary, and that's the United States. What can they do to distract and degrade the United States capability, whether that's economic, whether that's military, what kind of drain can they put on the United States? Uh, but they're also, I would say, China and Russia are very focused on themselves. You know, what's in it for me? So
Right.
Russia and Iran had an arrangement, an agreement. You know, you talked about the Shahed drones. You talked about that. You know, there's missiles that Iran's given Russia. Russia's given some surface-to-air missiles that were destroyed last year. You know, but what they didn't do is they didn't get the replacements in before this next round of strikes. And so I think Putin is acting transactional. So is Xi. So when we look at this, the best thing for Russia and China is that the United States is distracted in the Middle East. That
Right.
means their belief is there's less of a U.S. ability to focus on what Russia's doing in Ukraine and what China could do, you know, in the South China Sea or against Taiwan. You know what they're doing. The United States has less of an ability to focus there. So that's one positive. Now, I think after Operation Midnight Hammer, Russia and China are going, wait a minute, we just thought the US was going to talk, not act. Now they've acted. They backed up their words with action. And I think that's starting to send a very important strategic message to both of them, both Russia and China, that the United States will back up. That's something we hadn't had in the last administration. You know, and so you saw Russian advancement, you saw China continued assertiveness and aggressiveness in its theater. I think that's a positive. That's benefits that are paying well beyond our strike, our benefits that are paying well beyond the Middle East right now, looking at those adversaries. The same with North Korea, but you know, KJU is such a wild card in his behavior that you can't overlay what we expect to happen and for him to do. It's just he's a wild card. So we've got to watch that. But economically, you hit the nail on the head. You know, you talk about what China gets. They get a lot of oil at discounted prices from Iran. So they're going to come out, they'll condemn the US. Russia will condemn the US, but are they going to do anything physically? No. Because one, they don't want that interrupted flow. They don't want sanctions. They don't want anything to interfere with what they're trying to do for their own economic well-being. And so they're going to maintain that process. You're not going to see military equipment come rushing into Iran from either Russia or China. You'll get platitudes. You'll get "we
Right.
support you." You may get some statements made in the UN that are nothing more than, like I said, platitudes. So you'll look at that. That axis will show weakness, right? But
Right.
just because it shows weakness bilaterally between China, Iran, Russia, Iran, uh, what you still need to understand is it fractures our focus. In other words, we have to focus individually on Russia, individually on China, North Korea, and Iran. And then if they can do anything to continue destabilizing our focus, they're going to continue to do it. So that's kind of how that's going to play out. I know that sounds, I probably made it more complicated than I needed to on that answer.
No, I think that was great. I think that was great. And I think you also, I mean, in relation to all four of these countries, it's largely been, at least in the past, rhetorical and a lot, alliances, not formally, obviously, but alliances of convenience.
Yeah.
There's no ideological binds that hold these countries together. They're just kind of all have seemingly their backs up against the walls, and so any which way that they can support each other, they're likely to do. Now, that was in the past, obviously the past few years, and again, you and I have talked about this at length before, but we're starting to see that more material support come into play for all four of them, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
all of those reasons that I just mentioned, uh, you start to see that come into play. But again, ideologically, totally different from NATO countries, from Western democracies, where there is that common belief in individual rights and freedom of all sorts of the oppressed people, et
Right.
cetera, right?
Yeah.
There's nothing like that. There's no common bond that binds all four of those countries. So
No.
anyway, it's very interesting, I think, kind of telling to see all these different reactions. And importantly, that component that you just mentioned too, where they're sitting back and obviously monitoring everything that's going on just as we are. And they see, oh, wow, the US is actually going to, they're getting involved. They're doing something. Whereas I think previously, you definitely were not seeing that happen, right? So that
Right.
changes the math for them as well. Not only for this conflict, but I think for what they may or may not do in the future as well. Gosh, well, talking about Russia and Ukraine, we need to do another. I can't believe it's just so crazy. It's so wild how we all forget about that, but that is still going on today.
Yep.
Um,
Absolutely.
Man, okay. Well, Mark, I'm looking at the clock here. I know we are about at time. Um, we can truly, I mean, you and I are great at this. I mean, we could go on for a long time with the rest of the
Yeah, we
morning.
could.
There's so much more, but I want to give you back the morning here. So, Mark, before we do hop, I want to give you the mic. What is new in your world? What's going on? What are you working on? Obviously, Castle's a big one. But any new updates on your front, I think myself and everybody else would love to hear them.
Well, Garrett, thanks for allowing me to talk about Castle. It's something I wanted to give a shot and try that because I do believe the Castle Group, has an opportunity to offer some insight, like you're talking about. I mean, really, I would have to say the genesis might be from you. Looking at your approach and how things go out there, I said, you know what, maybe I can take that idea and work something from that in what we do. So we're talking about leadership. We're talking about strategy, understanding where you might want to get involved. I talked to some universities, other universities who were looking at sending people into some of these hotspots. And I tried to give them a threat perspective on while they're doing a humanitarian thing, that's a dangerous place to send your people. You've got to think about security. So things like that can benefit folks. Secondly, I've talked to you about these strategic events, but I've done a lot of interviews on the Israel-Hamas war in the Middle East, and I'm actually going to turn that into a book on the Israel-Hamas war, making the complex comprehensible, which happens to be Castle's tagline. It's a complex environment, a complex war, and I wanted to take those interviews, over 80 interviews, and kind of compile them into a little bit of how Intel does its work, what was happening at the time, what I got right, and what I got wrong, because I did make mistakes, and try to get that out there for some readers. And hopefully, we're going to have that out in a couple of weeks.
All right. Fantastic. Well, Mark, thank you so much yet again. You're always very generous with your time and very generous with your insights. So truly, thank you so much for the time. And again, we'll have to do this again soon. There's never a shortage of things to talk about going on in the world. So thank you.
Garrett, thank you. And your questions are spot on. I think you set this up very easy, but you asked some great questions, and I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss with you. Thank you very much.